Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a follow-up on my update video for Total War The Dawnless Days, this time the goal being to cover the major overhaul that the Erebor faction received. I covered Erebor and its units a good year ago, however the time has come to give them another close look. If you're new here, The Dawnless Days is a mod for Total War Attila, completely overhauling the game and setting it in the Third Age of Middle-earth. With its most recent update, the mod is at version 0.6.1 and is inching ever closer to completion. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Normally when I do a faction breakdown, I go over the history of the faction, both within the books and films of Tolkien's universe, before looking at the civilizations that inspired the faction. After that, I then look at the units, discussing their battlefield role and looking at their equipment and how historically authentic they are. However, because I covered the history of Erebor and its inspiration in my prior video on the faction, I'm going to leave it linked in the description and instead we'll just focus on the units themselves. With that said, we're going to hop into the changes made to the Erebor roster, beginning with the units that were included in the roster but have been removed as of this update. The Mattock Warriors, a silver tier 3 heavy shock infantry unit, no longer have a place in the Erebor roster, with the reason for their removal perhaps being that the faction had too many shock infantry units and was unbalanced, with the unit not really standing out that much. If the mod creators watch this video, perhaps they'd like to clarify in the comments, because it'd clear things up. The other two units that were removed, the silver tier 3 medium bow infantry archers of the Red Mountains, and the silver tier 3 very heavy shock infantry warriors of the Red Mountains, make sense no longer being in the Erebor roster, as the modders have revealed that the dwarves of the Oricani will be appearing in future updates as their own unique factions, so they no longer need to be combined with Erebor to have a role in the mod. Personally, while I really liked all three of the units that have been removed, I do understand why they did it. With that cleared up, we'll move on to the units actually appearing in the faction roster, beginning with the 4 unique generals. As of this update, the many units that could serve as generals for Erebor have been changed, with the first of the current batch of generals being Gimli, leading the Dwarven Buruk Guard. Gimli being the dwarven representative of the Fellowship and a main character in The Lord of the Rings, renowned for his ferocity in battle and friendship with the elf Legolas. While Gimli doesn't command troops during the War of the Ring, during the Fourth Age he becomes the Dwarven Lord of Aglarond, so it makes sense that he'd have a bodyguard protecting him, this unit being added in the most recent update. Looking at Gimli himself, he appears much as he does in the Peter Jackson films, wearing a mostly open-face helmet with cheek guards and a reinforced roof, the helmet most resembling the Migration-era Spangen helms. For armour, Gimli wears a hauberk of mail over which he wears a red tabard, with bronze gilded spaulders protecting his upper arms, his forearms being covered in leather vambraces. Overall, not the most heavily armoured dwarf, especially in comparison to the warrior he leads. However, his design from the films is iconic, so it makes sense that he'd appear like this. For weapons, he carries a large two-handed axe with a blade with cutouts, the axe generally being reminiscent of a Dane axe, although the cutout portions of the blade remind me of the ceremonial halberds and pontoons of the 16th century. The cutouts reducing the weight of the weapon, which makes it easy to use for extended periods of time, but does make it less devastating as there's less mass behind each hit. Apart from this weapon, on his back Gimli has a massive two-headed axe of Balin, which he uses throughout the films. While such an axe would have impressive power delivery upon hitting a foe, it's completely impractical, as it's so over the top and heavy that it'd be very difficult to use, although we can perhaps excuse it by saying that the dwarves are known for being stronger, so this weapon is easier for them to use. Turning to the Dwarven Buruk Guard, they're very heavily armoured, each dwarf having reinforced helmets with built-in face masks that resemble a cross between a Sallet and a Spangen helm. These helmets providing amazing protection for the most part, even if their oculari, the eye holes, are a bit too large. For their bodies they wear plate cuirasses with scale skirts protecting their upper legs. Their upper arms are protected by massive pauldrons with scale spaulders attached, while their forearms have plate vambraces and gauntlets straight out of the 16th century, their shins being protected by decorated greaves, a look being polished off by blue cloaks on their backs. Overall, the Buruk Guard have a mix of Migration-era and Renaissance aesthetic when it comes to their armour, and its fusion of highly decorated and engraved plate with scale armour. For weapons, the troops keep one-handed axes at their side, although their main weapons are a variety of large two-handed axes, some being flat-out Dane axes while others resemble Gimli's main axe, and others the two-headed fantasy axe found on Gimli's back. Overall, as a unit, these guys are fantastic shock infantry, capable of clearing a bloody swath through enemy ranks, though the same dangers to shock infantry apply to these guys, keeping them away from archers and shock cavalry, and you should do fine, although using them defensively is perhaps a waste of their talents. I recommend grabbing these guys as a general if you can, if you want an easily recognizable unique general, and one which is slightly cheaper compared to the other options in the Erebor roster, and which have slightly better defensive stats. Speaking of the other options in the Erebor roster, we come to the second unique general the faction can field, King Dain Ironfoot, leading the Sons of the Mountain, who was added as of the update. This iteration of Dain represents him as he was during the War of the Ring, the old battle-hardened king of Erebor who would die defending his realm against the Easterlings. Looking at Dain, he's an elderly dwarf not wearing a helmet, which is a mistake given that helmets protect the most important part of the body and are the one bit of armour most prioritised by soldiers. For armour, Dain wears a mail hauberk over which he has a plate cuirass, providing protection for his torso and plate folds keeping his upper legs safe. His waist covered by a gilded metal belt. Using his mail sleeves to keep his upper arms safe. For his lower arms, Dain relies on decorated vambraces while his shins are sheathed in plate greaves, his look being finished off by a bearskin cloak over his back. For a weapon, Dain wields his iconic red double-headed axe, the axe which he used to kill Azog the Defiler in the Lord of the Rings books, compared to the movies where Thorin Oakenshield kills the White Orc. Looking at the red axe, the entire weapon is made of metal including the haft, which did happen historically, as do the tinting and colouring of weapons and armour, so a bright red axe is implausible, although the double-headed design is, although to the weapon's credit is smaller than the massive fantasy two-headed axes we see. Overall, King Dain makes for an intimidating leader. Turning to his troops, the Sons of the Mountain, they are all heavily armed and armoured, wearing what could only be called the Dwarven Taken Corinthian helmets, with a metal plume atop them designed to resemble both horsehair plumes and the ridgeon wild boars, boars being an animal associated with Dain and the dwarves of the Iron Hills. Turning to their armour, they wear much the same equipment as Dain, the only major difference being their lack of metal belts and their massive gilded pauldrons. For weapons, the Sons of the Mountain use a polehammer of sorts, with a large block of spiked metal at the front designed to punch through armoured foes, while the back of the weapon has an axe head made for cleaving apart lighter armoured enemies. The weapon does lack a spike, which is a pretty common feature of a lot of these combination weapons near the end of the Middle Ages. However, it is plausible if a bit too thick and chunky for my liking. As a unit, these guys are better shock infantry than Gimli when it comes to going on the offensive, although they do have some shortcomings when it comes to defending compared to their competitors. If you want an army led by the King of Erebor, this is the unit to go with as far as I'm concerned, as it does everything expected of it, while looking cool as hell. Moving on to the next unique general unit, we have Dain Ironfoot leading the Sons of the Mountain again, although this time it's a younger version of him back when he was the Lord of the Iron Hills rather than the King of Erebor. This version of Dain was in the previous build of the mod but has been updated to look better. Looking at Dain, he is considerably younger, his grey beard now being a flaming red, this version of Dain being the one to fight in the Battle of the Five Armies, his appearance being based off of his look in the Five Armies film. To begin with, Dain wears a helmet which is amazing to see, perhaps indicating that he went senile in his older age and decided to ditch the helmet. Looking at his gilded helmet, it resembles those of his troops and much more ornate, with a massive crest upon it designed to resemble a tusked boar, the metal crest being painted to give it a splash of colour rather than relying on painted horsehair for decoration. For armour, Dain wears a gilded cuirass and folds of what I can only describe as a fantasy armoured skirt, which just looks horrible. Personally, I'd ditch that design and give him a mail skirt, which would look way better and more historically authentic. Dain's lower legs are protected by greaves and blocky sabatons, while his arms are covered in trusty mail and decorated vambraces. A massive bearskin cloak providing some protection. For a weapon, Dain wields a massive fantasy warhammer with two blocky heads. Such giant warhammers weren't used historically due to the immense weight of making such a weapon, and how badly it performed in battle, given far smaller and lighter weapons such as actual warhammers could attain the same exact result at a fraction of the price and weight. This weapon is used by the younger Dain during the Battle of the Five Armies film, although judging by his older version, he chooses to opt out of it and begin using his red axe for devastating effect. Looking at his men, they're equipped exactly the same as they are in the future, with the unit itself actually having the exact same stats and price as the older King Dain unit. What this means is that both units are interchangeable, with their selection coming down to whether you prefer the younger Dain or the older Dain. Overall, a great unit which really does an amazing job of representing Dain as he was during his time as the Lord of the Iron Hills. Moving on to the final and most expensive of all the Erebor generals, we have Balin leading the Mansion of Acclaimers, also new to the mod. Balin was a veteran warrior among Thorin's company, who after the quest to Erebor, ended up leading a group of dwarves to colonize the ruins of Moria, Balin dying during this effort and his colony being destroyed by the goblins of Moria. Looking at Balin, he's heavily armoured, although he lacks a helmet which is a rookie mistake. wearing a male hauberk over which he has a plate cuirass with attached scale skirt, making for very well defended upper legs. Barlin's shoulders are protected by pauldrons, while his lower arms have leather and plate van bases for defence, his lower legs being unarmoured. Unique among all the generals, Barlin and his troops use shields, the shield resembling a cross between a medieval heater shield and a Roman scutum, the shield being made of wood covered and rimmed in metal, with the metal being highly decorated, a boss of sorts being added over the upper half of the shield to provide more protection. For a weapon, Barlin uses in combination with his shield a sword that's about the size of a migration-era sword but with a unique diamond tip at the end, designed to give it the power and hitting strength of a mace or axe, this weapon being based off the pair that he initially uses at the beginning of the Hobbit trilogy. Well, such a sword design doesn't exist to my knowledge. Giving the swords larger and heavier heads to make them deadlier cutters was very much something that occurred historically, such as with the coppice. Looking at the Mansion Reclaimers, they wear rounded helmets with face masks resembling the earliest examples of prototype great helms, while some wear mail masks underneath their helmets for added protection, their body armour, shields and weapons being the same as Barlin, although some in the unit have white plumes atop their helmets. As a unit, these guys make for a great melee infantry unit, capable of gliding a path through enemy units, being equally adept at being on the defensive or leading a charge. While they aren't quite as capable of punching holes in enemy lines as the shock general units, these guys can endure a hell of a lot more when it comes to punishment. Personally, I'd recommend picking these guys as your general unit, as they give your army a unique reserve that they'd otherwise lack, giving your forces much needed diversity and flexibility. With Barlin covered, all of the unique generals added have been looked at, so we'll move on to the melee infantry line of the faction, starting with the Dwarven Company, a unit which has received a visual overhaul. Looking at the dwarves, they all wear basic helmets in the same style as Gimli, with a mixed fabric and metal design, some having central ridges while others lack them. For armour, they almost all lack it, although some in the unit have a variety of spolders and pauldrons protecting their upper arms, apart from that just wearing regular clothing such as tunic and robes into battle. I do like the attention to detail that all the dwarves prioritise helmets, which is absolutely correct as it's the most important bit of armour by far to have. Turning to their shields, they use large octagonal shields rimmed and embossed with metal, resembling bucklers and Viking-era shields in a way, although their octagonal shape gives away their dwarven heritage with their obsession with advanced shapes. In combination with the shields, the dwarves use one-handed swords which can only be described as falchions, more basic chopping blades used prominently by lower-class warriors, which reflects this unit perfectly. Looking at the unit's commanding officer, he is identical to his men except for his helmet, which is more ornate and resembles a crown, showing off his superior status. As a unit, these guys are your basic early game infantry, and are quite good, being more than a match for the rabble they're expected to face. A core part of your armies, these guys are a must-have, although once better infantry becomes available, I'd phase them out. Speaking of that better infantry, we have the Dwarven Warriors, another unit which has been redesigned, significantly more armoured than the previous unit. These guys all wear metal versions of the helmets used by the Dwarven Company, giving this unit 11th and 12th century aesthetic, some of the helmets being badged. For armour, they all have mail hauberks, although some wear robes over the top of them, everyone in the unit wearing leather gloves for their arms, although some have plate pauldrons and spolders for their upper arms. For shields, the Dwarven Warriors have hexagonal wooden shields covered in metal, with a raised centre making blows deflect more easily, the shields resembling ancient Greek hoplons. For weapons, the unit uses the basic diamond-shaped gladius-inspired sword used by the dwarves in the Hobbit films, which fits this unit's status as a more professional unit, his swords looking to be great for stabbing. Looking at the unit officer, he is identical to his men with the exception of his helmet, which is gilded and designed to resemble a dwarven crown, a sign of his rank. As a unit, these guys are your mid-tier infantry who can duke it out with the best of their contemporaries, being another core component of your armies who excel at defending and attacking. While I'd recommend replacing them once better infantry becomes available, in a supporting role these guys are still fairly useful late into the game. Three, two, one, 3, 2, 1. Moving on to the final melee infantry unit Erebor can field, we have the Ultra Elite Mansion Reclaimers, the same unit as that used by Barlin. These guys are yet another unit that has received a redesign. It has also changed classification, going from an axe unit to a sword unit. Because these guys and their officer are identical to Barlin's troops, I'm going to skip the description and move on to their battlefield role. Being as elite as they are, you can only actually have one of them in an army, although if you pick Byron as a general, you can field two technically, which is a nice way of boosting your army's strength. An incredibly tough unit, due to its restriction, it will never be the core of your army the way the previous units were. However, it can be an incredible bit of extra firepower to add at a pinch to your armies when needed. I wouldn't say this unit is necessarily the way the prior two were, but you'll be glad to have it up your sleeves in a tight spot, rather than to be found lacking. Moving on to the next type of infantry the faction can field, we have shock infantry beginning with the Dwarven Miners, another revamped unit. Completely unarmoured with the exception of their leather helmets for mining, these dwarves just wear their regular clothes and leather overalls, carrying small chisels at their side and their main weapons being pickaxes and mattocks. Using work tools as weapons was a staple of medieval warfare for the less fortunate parts of society, such as farmers, who took glaives and flails to war, so it makes sense here that conscripted miners would use their work tools, which are more than capable of causing grievous injuries and punching through armour. Skipping their officer, who's the same as a dwarven company officer, this unit is an early game shock infantry unit, which is pretty rare, especially for bronze tier armies. What this means is that while this unit is pretty lackluster compared to proper shock infantry, its main use is at a level when there's no competition against it, which means that this unit can run rampant against enemy rabble. For early game builds, I'd put more than a few of these guys in any prospective army, as they can be a very decisive battle winner. Overall, a fantastic unit, although they do get outclassed very quickly. Moving on to the next unit Erebor can field, we have the Erebor Axes, who are another redesigned unit. Looking at these dwarves, they wear quite a variety of armour, all bearing the same metal helmets as the dwarven warriors. Some of the unit wear scale and lamellar shirts crossed with mail skirts, while others have lamellar shirts and folds, while yet others have complete hauberks of plated mail in the style of the Mughals of India. In addition to this, some dwarves wear spolders and pauldrons, making for a mix of dwarves with protected and unprotected upper arms. For weapons, these troops discard shields and instead use large two-handed axes, some of them resembling Dane axes, others Gimli's axe, and others being two-headed Dane axes which are more plausible than the massive fancy axes seen elsewhere in the mod. Overall, their armour looks quite Eastern, with these guys giving me Hungarian and Rus vibes. Looking at their officer, he is equipped identically to the Dwarven Warrior officer, so we'll skip him and get into the unit role. As a unit, these guys are the clear replacement for the Dwarven Miners, being great in mid-game armies where they can compete, if not outperform, most other factions. I'd recommend recruiting these guys in great numbers and using them as the core of your army in mid-game builds, given that as long as you can take time to keep the enemy off their backs, these guys will clear a path across the battlefield. Moving to the next unit, we have the Erebor Axe Guards, a new unit added to the roster. Incredibly heavily armoured, these dwarves are essentially the Dwarven Baroque Guard of Gimli when it comes to appearance, with the exception of their lack of cloaks and their upper legs, which are protected by mail rather than scale, contributing to this unit's 15th century appearance. For weapons, the Axe Guard use a mix of large two-handed axes, some having small hammers on the back, similar to a pole axe, although missing the spike, while others have large two-handed fantasy axes. Turning to the officer, he is equipped much the same as his men, although he has scale folds and scale attachments to his pauldrons, which his troops lack, wielding a sword and shield instead of an axe. One thing to note is that he lacks mail on his arms, which means they're quite exposed wherever the plate fails to cover them. As a unit, these are your professional shock infantry, and it shows. These guys being a cut above the rest and easily being capable of being massed into a brutal armoured fist, in a way that reflects Erebor's focus on shock infantry. I'd recommend these guys as a standard part of all professional Erebor armies, as they more than get the job done, getting your hands on them being a priority. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Ultra Elite Ered Mithrin Veterans, another unit to receive a redesign, wearing very similar helmets to the Mansion Reclaimers, although these are designed to be reminiscent of crowns. These dwarves wear scale hauberks in conjunction with mail shirts and pauldrons, their forearms and lower legs being protected by van braces, gauntlets and greaves. Slung over their backs, the veterans have highly decorated hexagonal metal shields etched with two-headed dragon designs, shields being slung over backs being a common thing on battlefields depending on how a warrior fought. At their sides, the unit carries one-handed axes with cutouts in the heads, while for their main weapon they use fantasy pole hammers with large heads, a spiked tip which is good to see, and a backwards axe which is shaped like an arrowhead, with the edges of the arrow shape being used to snag enemies. While it's a cool design, it's not historically accurate, though it's less over the top than some of the other weapons. Turning to the officer, he's equipped the same as his men, although he uses a sword in combination with a shield, and his upper arms are protected by gilded spolders similar to Gimli. As a unit, while these guys are tougher than the Erebor Axe Guards, due to their lack of advanced armor, they're quite a bit more vulnerable to ranged units, which makes a major weakness even more glaring. Added to the fact you can only recruit one of these guys into an army, and I'd honestly say that while they're good, they're not worth getting. It's a unit that I'd personally skip. This lack of use is made all the more worse when you look at the next unit coming up, the Dwarven Bullock Guard. The exact same unit as that commanded by Gimli, this redesigned unit can serve as a general independent of unique generals, though it means you can only field 2 in addition to your general rather than a unique general plus 3 of them. The important thing to note there is despite being a tougher and more elite unit than the Eredimithrin veteran, these guys can be fielded in larger numbers and can serve as a general, boosting their importance. Equipped identically to Gimli's troops and led by an officer identical to his men apart from his shield and sword, these guys are the epitome of Erebor shock infantry and are an absolutely amazing unit to have beefing up your forces. For late game armies, I'd recommend having a plentiful supply of them, as they can turn the tide of battle when deployed judiciously. Overall, just fantastic. With these guys covered, we'll move on to the Axe Infantry of Erebor, beginning with the only Axe unit the faction has access to, the Erebor Axe Warriors. Yet another redesigned unit, these dwarves wear the same armor as the Erebor Axe Guards, all in the unit essentially being equipped the same as that unit's officer. In conjunction with their highly decorated octagonal shields etched with symbols of warhammers, these dwarves use a variety of one-handed axes, some being axes with hooked edges straight out of the 14th century, while others use more hatchet-shaped axes, and others have double-headed axes, which more resemble maces or the axes used on horseback by Persian cavalry in the early modern period. Overall, while these weapons are mainly historical, they don't really make sense with the armor of the unit, as do the shields, given that with how heavily armored these warriors are, shields wouldn't be that useful, and with the freeing up of a shield hand means that two-handed weapons more capable of killing armored foes than the axes of these troops could be used. Although if we follow that logical train of thought, we just end up with the Erebor Axe Guard, so in a roundabout way, it makes sense that these guys appear the way that they do. Skipping their shield and sword officer, as a unit these are the professional core of your late game army and can stand toe to toe with the flower of elven chivalry and the best that men have to offer. One of the best and toughest units in the game, it's a no-brainer to have these guys make up the bulk of your army as they can flatten most opponents. Overall, just an incredibly reliable unit that will always see service among the armies of Erebor, being their equivalent of the Gondor swordsmen, both in role and icon status. With these troops covered, we'll move on to the Spear Infantry of Erebor, beginning with the new unit added to the mod, the Erebor Spears. For all intents and purposes, this unit is the spear equivalent of the Dwarven Warriors, having the exact same armour and helmets, only being differentiated by their shields, which resemble smaller kite shields somewhat larger than heater shields rimmed in metal. For weapons, the dwarves use spears with very long straight blades, somewhat reminiscent of glaives and naganatas. These spears looking like they'd be excellent at cutting as well as stabbing. Finally, the officer looks the same as the Dwarven Warrior officer, so we'll skip him. As a unit, these guys fill a niche that was very much lacking previously, that being spearmen, with which to build a tough spear line and protect your forces from marauding cavalry, always a threat to the shock-oriented armies of Erebor. In open battles, I'd use these guys as support to keep the flanks of your advancing shock infantry safe, or when on the defensive in sieges, they excel at holding the line and buying time. Overall, a unit that has very much been needed to fill in a weakness that has been a sore spot for Erebor for a while now. Moving on to the next unit, we have another redesigned unit, the Erebor Spear Guard, which is a spear counterpart to the Erebor Axe Warriors, using the same armour and shields as that unit, only being differentiated by their weapon, which is a winged spear with attachments at the side of the head designed to catch and deflect enemy blows. The weapon looking very much like those used in the 15th century. Looking at the unit officer, he is more lightly equipped than his men, lacking mail to protect the gaps in his plate, which is a mistake. His only accessory to his plate being his scale skirt, which stands in contrast to the mail used by his men, as does his sword and shield combination. As a unit, these are your professional spearmen who make up an integral part of your late game armies, being either supporting units meant to ward off cavalry so your shock infantry can get to work dismantling enemy formations, or being the core of your army when defending fortifications. Capable of going toe to toe with just about any unit, they are a must have for any Erebor general, being a unit I would more than recommend, although they are outclassed by one unit. That unit is the redesigned, very elite Iron Guards of Erebor, a unit of warriors hailing from the Iron Mountains integrated into the armies of Erebor after Dane became king. Based very much of the infantry seen fighting the orcs in the Battle of the Five Armies film, these dwarves are very heavily armoured, bearing the same armour as the Sons of the Mountain, but in combination with large heater shields rimmed and bossed with metal, something that did not occur historically but works here, although it should be noted without how heavily armoured these warriors are, shields aren't necessary. In combination with their shields, the Iron Guards use spears with a more arrow-shaped head, the spear having attachments and wings in the shaft also designed to catch foes' weapons. The difference in weapon between these guys and the previous unit being a nice way of showing that different dwarves from different regions use different designs for weapons intended for the same role, reflecting real life. Turning to the unit officer, he's equipped mostly the same as his men, although his helmet bears a bronze boar crest meant to emulate Danes. Reflecting the seniority of the officer, his sword also setting him apart from the spear wielders. As a unit, these guys are very elite, meaning only 3 can be in an army at a time, although with how good they are, you only really need 3. I say that they're best suited as a support unit if your line desperately needs support, as the Erebor spear guards are more than capable of facing down most threats. As such, this unit will be a rare sight in Erebor armies, but when deployed, it may well be the linchpin upon which your whole strategy relies. With these guys covered, the spear units of Erebor have been looked at, so we'll move on to the next category of units, polearm infantry, by looking at the redesigned Erebor halberdiers. Heavily armoured infantry, these dwarves have the same equipment as the Erebor axes, which makes sense, given they're their polearm equivalent. However, instead of axes, these troops use halberds, the weapons having a mix of axe blades, spear tips and hooks, all designed to bring down enemy infantry and cavalry regardless of their armour, while at their sides they have short swords and axes. Halberds and other polearm weapons were increasingly widespread during the late Middle Ages, where lesser troops tended to use them, so it makes sense to see warriors in segmented plate and mail using these weapons, compared to dwarves armoured like late Middle Ages knights. Skipping their officer, who we've seen before, these guys are a useful, if niche part of your army if I'm being honest. Working well in conjunction with the shock infantry, they can tear apart enemy infantry formations, and when getting stuck into cavalry, revel and slaughter. However, ranged units can decimate them before they can even deploy as they lack extensive armour or shields, and cavalry will rip them apart if they charge into them, especially when out of formation. In the mid-game armies where they're expected to see play, I might include some, although I shouldn't think that they will ever really be the core of armies the way their spear and sword equivalents are. However, because Erebor lacks halberdiers until the very late game, they may well see service into more elite games, compared to their compatriots purely due to their availability. Moving on to the second and final polearm unit Erebor has access to, we have the Ultra Elite Tomb Wardens, another unit to be redesigned as of the update. Armour-wise, these dwarves are absolutely beautiful, wearing helmets resembling those worn in the Balkans and Near East by the Byzantines and Bulgarians, with attached scale and mail joined to faceplates reminiscent of the Cumans, their bodies being sheathed in mail shirts, over which they have gilded plate cuirasses, plate folds, and scale skirts, protecting their upper legs, while their arms have massive pauldrons with attached scales, plate vambraces, and gauntlets, the lower legs relying on gilded greaves and sabatons. Over their back, the Tomb Wardens wear decorated red cloaks, setting them apart from the blue cloaks worn by other units. For a weapon, these guys use gilded halberds of the same design as the previous unit, each warrior having a sword at their side and a beautiful red leather scabbard. Skipping their sword and shield wielding officer, as a unit these guys are ultra elite, only one of them being allowed in the army at a time. This means they can never be amassed in any significant way which limits their effectiveness in battle, although they are indomitable, breaking through almost all competition. However, as great as they are, ranged units are still a massive threat, and I've seen this unit, which is capable of killing hundreds of foe with ease, being broken by being focused down by archers in a way other shielded infantry can't. While amazing in battle, I'd personally say that this unit is very rarely required and can easily be skipped, although when it deploys it will more than make its presence known if you deploy it properly. With the Tomb Wardens covered, all the infantry in the faction have been covered, so we'll move on to archers, beginning with the only archer unit the faction has, the redesigned Dwarven Ranged Travellers. Completely unarmoured, these dwarves have only their robes and clothes for protection, relying on their recurve hunting bows to keep enemies away. Recurve bows were widely used in history and as a weapon make a lot of sense for dwarves, given their smaller size yet great power works well with the dwarven body and its limitations compared to longbows. Apart from their bows, these dwarves have only daggers for defence. skipping their almost unarmoured officer who at the very least has a helmet, shield and sword. These guys are your range power in the early game and as such are a key part of your armies, giving you the ability to exchange fire with enemies and thin out their ranks. More than competent against the enemies who are expected to face at such an early stage, they get outclassed real quick, so they should be replaced real quick. Add in the fact that they're sitting ducks are infantry and cavalry who in melee tear them apart, and they're altogether a very basic unit with one key use. Moving on to the next category of units Erebor can field, we have skirmishers, with the only skirmisher unit the faction has, the redesigned Erebor axe throwers. Very lightly armoured, these dwarves at the least have the mixed metal and fabric helmets we saw previously, with some in the unit having pauldrons and spolders to protect their shoulders. For melee, these dwarves use basic one-handed axes in combination with their cross-shaped metal shields, which remind me of some unique bucklers and shields in the late Middle Ages. However, the main weapon of these troops are their throwing axes, which they keep on their backs. Throwing axes are a very historic weapon, ranging from the tomahawks used by the native tribes of North America to the Francisca throwing axes used by the Franks, which ended up giving France its name. Throwing axes don't have anywhere near the range of bows or slings, however they're great at breaking up formations, especially if the throwing axe is designed to bounce off the ground, hitting warriors in the legs. The weapon is quite a unique one in the mod and makes for a unique unit, this weapon getting some representation being a nice touch. Skipping their standard officer, these guys are a very unique unit that offer their faction one-of-a-kind capabilities, being able to close with enemy forces and harass them with their axes before engaging a melee, and something that they perform better at than the ranged travellers, although heavy combat should be in general avoided, as should attacking cavalry. To best use this unit, moderation and smart implementation are the way to go, clearing enemy forces of archers so these guys can deploy without having to worry about being shredded by arrow volleys they can't contend with due to their short range. I'd use these guys in combination with your bowmen early on, but once better range forces become available, I slowly phase them out, although they do remain surprisingly useful in more advanced armies. Moving on to the next unit and next category of unit that Erebor can field, we have the newly added Iron Hill crossbows. A heavily armoured force of crossbowmen, all in the unit wear basic skull caps in the dwarven style. Their torsos being protected by mail hauberks while their arms are clad in leather. Mail was commonly used by archers and crossbowmen when available, especially as armour became more widespread, so it's good to see it here. These dwarves having falchions at their side in case of melee, their main weapon of course being the crossbow. Crossbow seeing incredibly widespread use throughout the Middle Ages all across the Old World, its relative ease of use making it a quickly adopted one by warriors, despite bans against its use. Dwarves are actually never mentioned using crossbows in Tolkien's universe, nor are they actually mentioned as far as I know, existing ever. However, for a while it's been common to see dwarves equipped with crossbows, and it makes sense as a weapon for them due to its compact size. Looking at their officer, he is equipped similarly to his troops apart from his boar crest adorned helmet and his use of a falchion in combination with an Iron Hills heater shield. As a unit, they're pretty unique, adding more of an Iron Hills presence to the Erebor roster. However, this heritage restricts their usefulness. Limited to a max of 3 per army, these guys would never be the core of your ranged forces in the mid-game, instead meaning at that point you'll be forced to rely on a conglomerate of the Iron Hill crossbows, the ranged travellers and throwing axes to provide ranged support, at least until better and more reliable forces become available. Overall, a very useful unit as it gives you some way of opposing enemies who field more robust lines of ranged units. Moving on to that aforementioned better and more reliable ranged force, we come to the last ranged unit that the faction can field, the redesigned Erebor crossbows. Equipped identically to the other Erebor units such as the spear guards and their officers, these guys are your professional ranged infantry, making up a key part of your late game armies, more than able to go toe to toe with the best archers of elves and men. Because they are crossbowmen, however, it means that they aren't capable of shooting over your lines of the enemy ranks, only be good at straight shots, so they are somewhat better suited for sieges where defensive lines allow them to excel. That said, they can still duke it out with the best of them, so they are more than great and necessary when playing as Erebor. A solid contingent of these guys is key to attaining victories in my book. With these guys covered, we'll move on to the category of cavalry, starting and finishing at the only cavalry unit the faction can field, the escort mercenaries. Riding unarmoured horses, these men wear a mix of armour styles, their helmets resembling salets with cheek guards. The helmets being gilded and enamelled, the look being topped off with a fur wrap around the helmet that gives it a very distinct Russian appearance, and a metal spike that serves no helmet apart from ornamentation, similar to the pickle helm used by German troops in World War I. As a helmet, it's quite unique, which I like. As for the rest of their armour, they wear scaled cuirasses with their upper arms being protected by leather spolders. While leather armor existed, I don't know if spolders did, so I can't say if this is historically inaccurate. For weapons, they wield beautiful longswords which appear to have a one-handed hilt for some reason despite their length, which is odd, the gold hilt being reminiscent of the metal artworks made during the Carolingian period. For defence, in conjunction with their swords, the men used shields of Erebor supplied to them by the dwarves, the shields in particular being the hexagonal metal shields that resemble a fusion of bucklers and hoplons, a fairly good shield for use by troops equipped as such. Skipping their officer who is distinguished by his gilded scale cuirass, this unit is for all intents and purposes the same as the escort cavalry unit fielded by Dale. These guys being set apart purely by their shields and their number restriction, which means only 3 can be deployed in any prospective Erebor army. What this means is that Erebor cannot be expected to field large armies of horsemen capable of contesting other horse-oriented factions, these guys being best used either defensively to ward off enemy horsemen or to take advantage of crumbling enemy lines and hitting them where it hurts. Their status as melee cavalry meaning that they can stay in the fight longer than shock cavalry but can't deal as much damage on the charge. Overall, a unit that gives Erebor mobility and striking power it desperately needs, although there might not be enough when push comes to shove. With the cavalry covered, it will move on to the final unit Erebor can field, its sole artillery unit, the Onager. Looking at the crew, there's the same heavily armoured Erebor troops as the crossbows and spear guard, although they discard both shields and weapons it seems. As a unit, these guys are critical in giving you the ability to punch holes in enemy fortifications and allowing you to counter enemy fire from artillery with shots of your own. Overall, they help even the balance between factions by being available to all factions, although they are in some ways markedly inferior to more powerful and rarer artillery such as trebuchets. With this unit covered, all the units in the Erebor faction have been looked at, so we'll look at the faction as a whole. Overall, the recent Erebor update merely confirmed what we knew about the dwarves, that they're a faction that very much relies on their superior infantry to attain wins, ranged units, and especially cavalry, taking a back seat. This new Erebor is in some ways more balanced, losing its previous overwhelming focus on shock infantry, evening out the roster a bit, which is nice to see, while not losing the distinct nature of Erebor, which is a tough act to balance. Erebor as a whole is a faction that more than seems complete, although if they add more units to the roster, I'll be more than happy to see them. If you guys have enjoyed this video, please give a like and subscribe. I know it might not seem like much for you, but for such a small channel, it truly does mean the absolute world. If you guys have any queries or anything to say, please let it be heard in the comments. I love interacting with you, as your insights often help me see things I'd otherwise miss. Rest assured, more videos on this amazing mod will be coming up, as will videos for the Last Alliance Total War. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.